Okay. Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me here. I guess I might as well put my face on. Yeah. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so we are going to be using this book as a reference. I don't know if that's probably backwards. Yep, look at that. So this is a book by Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev called The Miracles of Jesus. Look at how thick this book is. That is a nice thick book. I want to tell you a little bit about Metropolitan Hilarion first. He's a colorful character, to say the least, and I'm not going to go into great detail about why I consider him colorful, but I will say he is my age, which is, of course, very exciting to have a metropolitan as old as I am. But more than that, he is the composer of not one, but two major symphonies. He has conducted the Moscow Symphony Orchestra. He has written, this is volume 3 of 5 of this series. And he has written, I think it's a 7-volume set on the Orthodox Church. He's a scholar on Saint Isaac the Syrian. He's written a book on prayer. And up until a very short amount of time ago, he was the, how do they call it? The minister or the Metropolitan of External Affairs to the Russian Orthodox Church. That lasted as long as the start of the Ukrainian war, and all of a sudden now he's found himself in Belarus. I don't know what he's doing there. Maybe he's writing more books, but that's the story. So we are going to talk about the miracles of Jesus, but we're going to use him as a framework because he did all the dirty work, and that way I don't have to. Yes, I know that's lazy, but okay. So can anyone tell me, other than Albert and probably Courgette, what the first miracle of Jesus was?
Cana.
Oh, even Norma's got it. Okay, so it's the wine into water. Or no, is it? It's the other way around, isn't it? Water into wine. Yeah, it's the wedding at Cana, right? It's discussed in one gospel and only one gospel. It's the Gospel of John, and it's actually one of the very first things that St. John talks about in his gospel. Okay, and if anyone has any questions, you can do one of two things. You can either just ask it, or you can put a message in the chat. I see we have some messages there already. If you have questions, you can ask it there, and then I can sort of use that as an opportunity to kind of calm down what I'm talking about and answer the questions. So we can do it that way. All right. Anyway, so continuing on. So he, the first miracle that Jesus performed is on the wedding in Cana. Norma, no, you don't have your glasses. Albert, would you do me a favor, please, and read St. John 2, chapter 2, go verse 1 through 11, please. Nice and loud.
On the third day, there was a marriage at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the marriage with his disciples. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "O woman, what have you to do with me? My hour is not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now 6 stone jars were standing there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the steward of the feast." So they took it. When the steward of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The steward of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when the men have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
Okay, thank you. So we have in the Gospel of John this wondrous story of a marriage feast that's going on in Cana of Galilee. So Jesus was invited, as was, well, at this point, how many disciples did he have? According to the Gospel of John, maybe 5. Okay, so it'd be John and Andrew and Peter, Philip and Nathaniel. So even John's brother James hasn't quite joined yet. We know that John did because he's reporting all of this. So that's basically the understanding that we have. So the disciple group is still forming, but not quite there yet. So what Metropolitan Hilarion does first is he points out that this indeed is only told in the Gospel of St. John, and indeed rather early. And the reason for that is, well, manifold. The first reason is that St. John's Gospel is a very different gospel from the other 3. Okay, the other 3 basically give a historical account, and it tells it in a narrative way so that this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. And in all of those examples in Matthew, Mark, and in Luke, they usually just put it there for you to figure out. Okay, now Jesus will talk in parables, and later Jesus will or will not explain the parable to his disciples. But he doesn't necessarily, the writer doesn't necessarily sit there and try to explain things to you. John's not that way. He does it completely backwards. He does it in terms of this miracle happened, and this is why this miracle happened. Okay, so he gives a theological explanation. There's very little that happens in the Gospel of John where there isn't some kind of theological explanation for why this or that happened. Think about his time in the Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, that is that in the Last Supper, and that theological oration that Christ gives is like a 5-minute long oration that I give on the night of Holy Thursday. It's a very long theological interpretation. In Luke, it's just, let this cup pass from me in our Lord sweat's blood. I mean, it's a very different way of presenting things. So John's message at the very conclusion of this miracle is that it manifested his glory before his disciples, and they believed in him. So that's why the miracle happened. Okay, so that the disciples would believe in him. Okay, so a couple of other details. Cana in Galilee is the location of that. And this is the only time that Cana is mentioned in all of the Gospels. Nathaniel was born there, according to John and the Gospel of St. John, chapter 21, verse 2. And the fact that Jesus ended up in Cana days after meeting Nathaniel suggests that there's a family in the wedding party who is somehow connected to Nathaniel. It's a very small town in Galilee, and it's likely that everyone knew there, and intermarriage was actually kind of common back then. And if the family was not immediately connected with Nathaniel, then it came from some other person in that party who had some kind of connection in that way. Okay, so another thing to point out is that this wedding happened when? When do we have our weddings? Usually it's either on Saturday or it's on Sunday. Okay, why? Well, for the most part, because that's what's convenient, but in this case, it's on the 3rd day. Okay, so the first day of the week is Sunday, as we know from the telling of our Lord's resurrection. So this wedding happens on Tuesday. Okay, so that's interesting. All right, so we have a wedding happening on Tuesday in a small little town called Cana, where there's some kind of familial connection. Okay, so in accordance with the practices of the time, the family of both the bride and the groom, as well as both families, were invited to this great wedding feast. It usually occurred in the house of the groom or his father. And these feasts usually continued for a long time, like 7 days, or in some cases, it lasted 10 or 2 weeks, 10 days or 2 weeks. So if you take a look at Judges 14:12, or if you look at Tobit 11:17 or Tobit 10:7, you can see examples of these weddings and the length of time that they take. Okay, so there are several theories as to why the wine ran out, but you can just assume it was lasting a long time and the people were drinking rather predictably. Okay, so that's part one. The setting is part one. And in the setting, they're there, and then someone comes and tells the mother of Jesus, and notice in this particular passage, including actually the entire passage or the writing of the Gospel of St. John, it always says Jesus's mother. It never says Mary. Okay. So it's always the mother of Jesus this, the mother of Jesus that, but never Mary, the mother of Jesus this or that.
Why?
It's just how John chose to tell the story. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about the different Gospels is that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written earlier than the Gospel of St. John. We don't know how early, but we know they were written earlier. And we can also understand by looking at the names of the Gospels. We have Matthew, who we would assume is also known as Levi amongst the disciples. So he is actually a disciple who wrote that gospel. Mark is not a disciple. Luke is not a disciple. John is a disciple. Okay, so 2 of the 4 are disciples. Mark and Luke are both mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, and it is understood just by how those Gospels are written. I mean, the Gospel of Luke anyway is written. Luke and Acts both are written by Luke. Okay, so Luke is the first part of the 2-part series from St. Luke's perspective, and the Acts of the Apostles is the second. Okay, Mark is considered the earliest of them all. It is sparing in its descriptions of things and everything. There's no birth narrative account in the Gospel of St. Mark. And everything's like, and then Jesus did this, and then Jesus did this, and then Jesus did that, and then Jesus, there's never any respite, no lengthy discourses like we have in some of the other. So Mark first, Luke and Matthew second, John then comes later. And by then, John's aware of all these different Gospels. He knows what's going on. And so he's content with what was written in those other Gospels. So his Gospel is mainly intended to explain from a theological perspective what's going on, not a historical perspective, but a theological perspective. And that's why we have the Cana of Galilee wedding, but we have the explanation of everything that takes place in that process. It's all throughout his Gospel. This happened because of this. And so that's one of the other things to pick up from this. So there's a wedding at Cana of Galilee. And we also understood the historical context for these weddings. And so the next thing to look at is the request itself. They come to Jesus's mother, and she looks to him and says, they have no wine. And so the Jesus's answer is taken somewhat, there's some confusion about what's going on there.
I thought maybe it showed he was human.
It shows he's human. He's kind of mean to her. I mean,
I
some
mean,
people would
way,
think he's
yeah.
kind of mean to her, right? What have I to do with you, woman?
That's what I meant. I noticed that. I said that's
Kind of grumpy. Sounds like how your kids talk to you, huh? Or how I talk to my mom.
Jeffrey's like that. I'll tell him what to do, what to do. You do this, do that, and he'll say, "I know what to do." But
Oh,
he
my.
always does what.
But
I
he
say.
always does it. Always follows
And that's
through.
what Jesus did. He did what his mother told him.
Yep. And that's what happens, isn't it?
Mhm.
So let's take a look at what Metropolitan Hilarion says about this. Let me see if I can, something I pulled. Okay. When Jesus says woman, he doesn't just use that in this particular passage. He uses it elsewhere in the Gospel of St. John. He uses it in chapter 4, verse 21. He uses it in chapter 8, verse 10. He uses it in 20, verse 13. Yeah, he says it. That last one that I mentioned, 20:13, is indeed when he is on the cross. He doesn't say, Mom, this is your son. He doesn't say, Mary, this is your son. He says, woman, behold your son. And then he says to John, behold your mother. So there is that connection, but he still uses those kinds of addresses. And in fact, that comment of what have I to do with you, that is actually another common passage that exists within the Jewish community. Okay, so it is not really a surprise that he would do that. He is using the language and the idioms of the time. So it's not really, I mean, for us, it's seen as something kind of uncomfortable. But anyway, let's look at this. So St. John Chrysostom says that for she desired to, okay, they're trying to explain the motivations, why she would say it in the first place, and then why Jesus would give the response that he did. So this is St. John Chrysostom. He says that she desired both to do them a favor and through her son to render herself more conspicuous. Perhaps, too, she had some human feelings, like his brethren, when they said to him, show yourself to the world, as it is said in John 17:4, desiring to gain credit from his miracles. Therefore, he answered somewhat vehemently. He continues by saying that she, because she had borne him, claimed, according to the custom of other mothers, to direct him in all things. That sounds familiar. And when she ought to have reverenced and worshiped him. Okay, so that's an interesting way to put it. And you can certainly say that. Since she did not want to submit to him, but would in all cases have claimed the superiority as being his mother, this is again John Chrysostom talking, therefore he replied as he did to them who spoke to him. Otherwise, he could not have led her up, he could have let up her thoughts from his present lowliness to his future exaltation, as she expected that she should always be honored by him as by a son, and not that she should come as her, that he should come as her master. Okay, so that's John talking about, this is homily 21 of his homilies on St. John, just in case you want to take a look at that in your leisurely time. Okay, so we have that way of looking. Why did Mary say it? Well, maybe it was to gain a little bit of notoriety. Is it risky to disagree with St. John Chrysostom? Maybe, but that is certainly at odds with certain other traditions within Orthodoxy who claim the perfection of the Mother of God. But they even people like Saint Sophronia and others, more contemporary thinkers point out that even if she said this in a way that isn't like St. John says, even if there is that particular case, there is still the whole matter of Mary coming to him in various circumstances and asking for her to come, or for him to come with her, right? He's talking in the synagogue and they say to him, your mother and your brothers are outside waiting for you. And he gets indignant and he says, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? But the ones that hear the word of God and do it. So there's always that contention between the family connection and his ministry on earth. And there can be some credit given to her to say, you know what, she did give birth to him. She carried him for 9 months. She nursed him at her breast. She grew him as a child. So she has a different relationship with him than everyone else does. And it could be easy to forget that not only is she nursing human Jesus, but she's nursing God, which is a really weird thing to imagine, but that's exactly what we believe. So, all right. So remember that in the Orthodox Church, we believe that the Mother of God is perfect, that she never sinned. Not perfect, but that she never sinned. So even if she said what she said in here to gain some form of notoriety, and that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't push that very hard. But it would help to explain it, but I think that's maybe pushing too hard. The bottom line is, she told him they have no wine. He went ahead and gave them wine, and it manifested his glory. So that's probably enough. All right. So continuing on, both Chrysostom and many contemporary commentators on the text take as their starting point the idea that Jesus's answer to his mother was not altogether respectful. The phrase, what concern do you have to do with me, is a particularly Semitic phrase. We find similar phrases in the Old Testament. One example is that of Elias, our beloved prophet, with the widow in 1 Kings 17:18. What does he say? or what is the widow addressed to the prophet by the widow? What does the widow say to Elias? What have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? The question of the widow contains a rebuke that the prophet came too late because her son was already dead. Right? So Chrysostom thinks that this intonation can be heard in the words of Jesus towards his mother, instructing her for the future not to be like this, because though he was careful to honor his mother, yet he cared much more for the salvation of her soul and for doing the good which to the many, for which he took upon him the flesh. These were the words, not of one speaking rudely to his mother, but belonging to a wise dispensation, which brought her into the right frame of mind and provided that the miracles should be attended with honor, and the honor that which was appropriate for the circumstances. Okay, so again, this also is from the homilies of St. John Chrysostom, again, homily 21. Okay. And if you have any questions or commentaries, you're more than welcome to ask or say. What does Jesus mean by my time has not yet come? The author of the fourth gospel understands this expression exclusively from the context of the imminent suffering and death of Christ. We find similar expressions in the fourth gospel several times. When his brothers invited him to come to the feast in Jerusalem, what does he say? My time has not yet fully come. When the Jews wanted to seize him, no one could because his hour had not yet come. So that's John 7:8, John 7:30. On the contrary, before the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour was come and that he should depart out of this world unto the Father. That's John 13:1. And for this reason, he washed the feet of his disciples. Mark records that in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed for the hour for him for it to pass him by, if it was at all possible. Okay. All right. So even at that point, Jesus is talking about what is coming for him. So when he says, my hour is not yet come, he's talking about the hour of his suffering and his death. Okay. The words of Jesus' mother, directed at the listeners, also force us to doubt the aptness of an interpretation founded on the idea that she did not recognize the divine dignity of her son. If that were so, why would she say to her listeners, whatever he says unto you, do it? Up to this point, he had not accomplished any miracles yet, nor had he revealed his supernatural abilities in any way. He lived as one among many. So think about that. That's another one of those turns of the passage. When you hear her say, whatever it is that he says to you, do it, she's not talking to the steward of the feast. She's talking to us. Okay. That's an interesting turn, but I think it's an appropriate one. She's saying that to anyone who has ears to hear. Whatever he says, do it, because he's about to manifest not only this miracle, but the greatest miracle of all, which is being risen from the dead. All right, any questions? All right, so then the next thing that comes up is the issue of transforming water into wine. Now, Metropolitan Hilarion is a modern day scholar, and if you can imagine, if you try to read what German scholars or modern day scholars are trying to say in terms of the water becoming wine, most of them are not willing to acknowledge the existence of any miracles, let alone this particular one. So what would they say? Well, one says that everyone was hypnotized. That's a fun one. Another one says that it came as a result of the cult of Dionysius. Dionysius is, you ever heard of a Bacchanalian feast? Well, Bacchus and Dionysius are the same person, depending on if you're Greek or if you're Roman. But basically, they're the god of wine, the god of partying, the god of, festivals, that kind of thing. Usually they're put in opposition to people like Apollo, who is more, he's more rigid in following rules. The story of the miracle became a linking point between the two religions, it is argued. That's Rudolf Bultmann, for those of you who know that is. But these aren't really considered serious scholarship, and so they've been summarily dismissed. It is important to remember that this is the only occasion that this miracle is remembered in all of the Gospels, and that he does see some kind of theological truth that in terms of this being a manifestation of Christ's power. In the episode, there's also, in the Gospel of John, a very strong connection between this particular event where you transform water into wine and one of the feeding of the multitudes with the bread. Okay, so in that you have the bread and you have the wine, which becomes an immediate connection to the Holy Eucharist. Okay. All right, water is the symbol of baptism. Bread and wine are the symbols of the Eucharist. The transformation of water into wine at the wedding feast doubtless has Eucharistic connotations. Again, this is Metropolitan Hilarion. This is how the event was understood in the early church. It is no coincidence that in frescoes and bas-reliefs of Christian Roman catacombs, we find the two themes. We find the wedding at Cana, and again, the multiplication of the loaves. These two miracles are purposefully close to each other in the Gospel of St. John. And the miracle of the multiplication of loaves is explicitly interpreted in a Eucharistic context. Immediately after it follows the discussion of the bread that came down from heaven, which is a reference to Christ, the living bread. The image at the wedding feast also has a deep symbolism for John. In Revelation, John paints a picture of the wedding of the Lamb, during which the angel says, "Blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb." This image is used by Jesus himself, including the parable of those called to the wedding feast, Matthew 22, verses 1 through 14, Luke 14, verses 16 through 24, which from the earliest times was understood to be a symbol of the Eucharist. And finally, the Eucharistic context is indicated by what happened to the water. It was transformed into wine. Of all the 30 miracles that we find in the Gospels, so that'll be a quiz question, this is the only one where he transfers something into something else. So he takes water and he turns it into wine. But that is the only miraculous example that we have where something was one thing and becomes another thing. The others, raising from the dead, you could say it's transformed from death to life, or healing of a broken thing into a whole thing, but those are still the same thing. They're still things, okay? They're not different things, all right? A central point of the Eucharistic theology is the transformation of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. It occurs immediately after the moment when the priest remembers the life of Christ and his passions, underlining especially the mystical supper, the Last Supper. It is impossible to deny the Eucharistic interpretation of the marriage in Cana of Galilee, during which Christ foretold his suffering and death for the first time, and then transformed the water into wine. At the very least, it would be difficult to explain why John included it in his gospel otherwise. Okay. So continuing on, we should also note that Jesus uses the symbol of wine to indicate the newness of his teaching compared to Old Testament regulations. For example, when he says the new wine should not be poured into old wineskins, that's found in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In the wedding scene, we see 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of the purification of the Jews. These water pots symbolize the old Jewish rituals and rites, which are going to be transformed by a new teaching and new liturgical culture centered on the Eucharist. We also note that Jesus soundly criticized the rites associated with washing as an expression of hypocrisy typical of the Pharisees. That's found in particular in the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 1, or chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. You want to read that for me? We'll go ahead and read
What
that.
is that again?
It's Mark 7, verses 1 through 8.
7. Now, when the Pharisees gathered together to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of the disciples ate with hands defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, observing the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they purify themselves, and there are many other traditions which they observe, the washing of cups and pots and vessels of bronze. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with hands defiled? And he said to them, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written? This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold fast the tradition of men.
Okay, so we see there our Lord is chastising them for upholding certain things of their tradition while ignoring others. Elsewhere in the Gospels, we hear this during the bridegroom matin services during Holy Week, where it talks about how they clean the outside of the cup, but that the inside of the cup is full of filth and rapacity. I love that word. So basically, it's the impurity that is masked by the cleaning of the outside. And so we see here an example where, these are the cleaning pots. That's what these things were supposed to be used for. And Christ turns that water that was intended for these old rites into new wine. Another thing to point out, think about the difference between water and wine, at least from their perspective, okay? What happens when you drink wine?
You're drunk.
You get drunk. What happens if you leave wine in a wineskin and you leave it outside?
Turns to vinegar.
Well, it also does something else, right? It explodes.
Oh,
If you leave it
okay.
outside
I didn't know
in the
that.
sun, it will expand and expand and expand, and eventually it will burst. What does water do? Nothing.
Well,
It won't make you drunk.
yeah.
Again, I'm looking from that's why I said the old days, because nowadays we can look at a microscope and see the microbes in the water and, who knows what in the wine. But wine is seen as an enlivener, okay? Something that enlivens us. That's why we become inebriated when we drink wine, because there's something in it that's alive and affects us. It's the same image they use for leaven in bread. And to be honest with you, there's not a whole lot of difference, okay? The yeast that is found in bread that causes it to rise is very similar to the things, the agents that are used to make water or grape juice, if you will, into wine. Very similar. They're living things. And so it is something that takes what is dead and makes it alive. Okay. So the water being turned into wine takes something that is dead and brings it into life. All right. So let's see. What else can we do here? All right, here's an image in Isaiah of the symbols of marriage and wine used together. As the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall thy God rejoice over thee. The Lord has sworn by his right hand, and by the arm of his strength. Surely I will no more give thy grain as food for thine enemies. And the sons of the stranger shall not drink thy wine, for which thou hast labored. They that have gathered it shall eat it. Praise the Lord, for they have brought it together, and shall drink it in the courts of my holiness. Okay, so all of these texts, I'll read a couple of more that are a little just more specifically dealing with the images of wine. Isaiah 25:6. And in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of wines on the lees well refined. Jeremiah 31:12. Therefore they shall come and sing in the height of Zion, and shall flow together to the goodness of the Lord, for wheat, and for wine, and for oil, for all the young of the flock and of the herd. And their souls shall be a watered garden, and they shall not sorrow any more at all. So these images are images that John, the gospel writer, would have been very familiar with. And so when he was speaking of what was happening in the wedding in Cana in Galilee, he had all of these things in the back of his mind. There are four major elements in our sacramental life, okay? They are wheat, wine, water, and oil. Okay, with those four things, you have the sum and total of just about every sacrament that we have. If there's anything that's involved that uses a material thing, those things are there, okay? Baptism, water is the obvious one, but you also use oil. Chrismation, oil. Eucharist, well, that's wine, water, right? Poured into the chalice. Wheat to make the bread, sometimes oil, not so much, but for unction, oil and wine. So we have those four elements. And so those things come into play as things that go from death to life. They all bring some kind of image into that. Okay, so what else we got? So we talk also in our wedding feast of our, even to this day, but also throughout history, of how Christ's presence at the wedding made the wedding sanctified. Weddings themselves are considered honorable and holy within our tradition. So the Christian tradition interprets Jesus's presence at the wedding in Cana as Christ's blessing of the marriage union and the bearing of children. According to St. Cyril of Alexandria, Jesus was present in order to sanctify the very beginning of the birth of man. For it was fitting that he, who was renewing the very nature of man and refashioning it for the better, should not only impart his blessing unto those who are already called into being, but also to prepare before grace for those who were soon to be born, and to make holy their entrance into being. St. Cyril reminds the reader that the Old Testament curse, in sorrow shalt thou bring forth children, the curse that God tells to Eve as she is going to deliver in pain. Woman needed to be freed of this curse, which is what Christ did. For he, this is a quote, the delight and joy of all, honored marriage with his presence, that he might expel the old shame of childbearing. This is found in St. Cyril's own commentary on St. John. This explanation is also included in the Orthodox marriage service, as I just said. In the beginning of the rite, the deacon intones a litany that contains the petition, may this marriage be blessed, as was the marriage in Cana of Galilee. And later on, a prayer of the priest is said in this way, O Lord our God, who in thy saving providence didst vouchsafe by thy presence in Cana of Galilee to declare marriage honorable, do thou the same, Lord, now also maintain in peace and concord thy servants, the male and the groom and the bride, whom thou hast been pleased to join together. Cause their marriage to be honorable, preserve their bed undefiled, mercifully grant that they may live together in purity, and enable them to reach a ripe old age, walking in thy commandments with a pure heart. So that's the prayer in the wedding service. And then Metropolitan Valerian continues, the transformation of water into wine, as we already said, is a symbol of the transformation of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. It is also a symbol of the change that a husband and wife undergo in marriage when the two become one flesh, as is said in Genesis 2:24, and as St. John Chrysostom himself said, he is not the one yet united, but half the one. You see the mystery of marriage? He made of one, one. And again, having made of these two, one. So he makes one so that the man is also produced of one. For man and wife are not two men, but one man. This union occurs thanks to the mutual love of the partners. Since this is friendship, that the lover and the beloved should no longer be two persons divided, but in a manner, one single person, a thing which no how takes place except from love. Okay, so there we go. A little bit more esoteric, but you get the idea that through this act, Christ is sanctifying marriage. He is, and this reaches a bit of a pinnacle in the writings of St. Paul, because Paul has a very different view of things. He sees the urgency of following Christ as the most important thing that we have in our lives. He maybe believes that Christ is coming back. He may believe there's just not enough time to do both things. Whatever the case may be, St. Paul basically says that marriage is something that is really put into place so that people don't burn. You know, they have their desires and their lusts, and they need to be satisfied in a way that is sanctified. And so they go away. You know, he says it is preferred that you remain celibate, but in cases of weakness, it's fully okay to marry. That's Paul. That's not what Jesus says. Okay, it's not what Jesus says. Jesus repeats back what we have in that issue of Genesis, where the two become one flesh, and he sanctifies that union through his presence at the feast in Cana of Galilee. All right, so there we have an unambiguous reference. Again, it's entirely likely that Paul's sense is wrapped up in his urgency, that time is short and you don't have time to do both things. You need to do the things that are well-pleasing to God, and that means you become his disciple, forsaking all else. You're not a slave, you're not free. You're not a male, you're not a female. You're not a Jew, you're not a Greek. All of those things are labels that are appended to somebody. You are a follower of Christ, period. And that's it. So in many senses, Paul could be seen as planting seeds for monasticism in later days. Okay, so then finally, according to Metropolitan Hilarion, we need to address the matter of Mary's presence at the feast. So I'm just going to read this, I think. We also must say something about the role of the miracle of Cana in Galilee in Christian teaching about the Virgin Mary. In the gospel, there is no little written about her that many interpreters who have no connection to the interpretive tradition of the church have concluded that she played no role whatsoever in his life or in the Christian community after his death. These commentators claim that only many centuries later, during the era of the Christological controversies, like in the 5th century, the church began to ascribe a special significance to her. Such an opinion can be strengthened by reading early sources up to the 4th century, such as the aforementioned quote of St. John, where we talked about that, where the mother was spoken of without a special regard for her, without special piety. Based on such a reading of the event and such an interpretation of the early church's history, many Protestant scholars of the gospel see in the events of the wedding of Cana a confirmation that the cult of the Mother of God is a rather late phenomenon, uncharacteristic of the faith of the early church. Catholic commentators, on the contrary, see in this an indication of the Virgin Mary's special role in the history of salvation. Her words, "Whatever he says to you, do it," are interpreted as a command to obey the Son of God, left behind as a testament for all times and for all mankind. The story, the wedding of Cana in Galilee, is the only miracle narrative in the gospel where the presence of the mother of Jesus is mentioned. Moreover, this miracle is accomplished as a result of her request, and the servants who fill the water pots with water are filling her command, not Christ's. Though Jesus performs the miracle, she plays a significant role in the narrative. In the Gospel of John, the next time she appears in that text is at the cross of her son. One cannot avoid seeing the connection between these two appearances of the mother of Jesus, at the beginning of his public ministry, his first miracle, and at the very end, at the climactic moment at the cross. It is as though John is indicating her continued, though invisible, presence during the entire gospel narrative. In addition, one cannot fail to remember the image of the woman clothed with the sun seen in Revelation 12:1. In the church's tradition, beginning with the writing of Hippolytus of Rome, let's see, who wrote, when did he write? Probably in the 100s and 200s of after Christ. This image is usually represented as a symbol of the church, not of the mother of God. However, we must not reject the connection between this image and the mother of God, as St. Andrew of Caesarea mentions in such an interpretation found in his comment on the Apocalypse, on the book of Revelation. Especially considering that the woman clothed with the sun gives birth to a man-child who rules all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. See Revelation 12:5. There is a clear allusion to Psalm 2, which was interpreted as messianic by the early church. The Lord said to me, "Thou art my son. This day I have begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee nations for thine inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt rule them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt shatter them like the potter's vessel." Even Jesus saw this psalm as a reflection of himself. Even if we are to accept the woman clothed in the sun as a symbol of the church and not the mother of God, we must remember that the Bible often conflates symbols with real historical figures. In the early church, the Virgin Mary herself was used as a symbol for the church. The words of the psalmist, "Hearken, O daughter, and see, and incline thy ear. Forget also thy people and thy father's house, and the king shall desire thy beauty." That's Psalm 44, verses 10 and 11. Those are usually understood to be a prophecy of the Virgin Mary. However, Justin the philosopher, who wrote in the 200s, interprets this passage as a symbol of the church. Moreover, that the word of God speaks to those who believe in him as being one soul, one synagogue, one church, as to a daughter. And thus it addresses the church, which is sprung from his name and partakes of his name. That is seen in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho in chapter 26. The Apostle Paul spoke of Christ as the second Adam, seen in 1 Corinthians 15. Continuing this theological train of thought, by the 2nd century, the church began to speak of the Virgin Mary as the second Eve. According to Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, Eve, having become disobedient, was made the cause of death, both to herself and to the entire human race. So also did Mary, by yielding obedience, become the cause of salvation, both to herself and to the whole human race. Through the obedience of Mary, the knot of Eve's disobedience was untied. For what the Virgin Eve had bound fast through unbelief, this did the Virgin Mary set free through her faith. This is seen in Irenaeus's Against the Heresies. The early path of Jesus is a path of humiliation and kenosis. On this path, from the beginning to end, Jesus' mother accompanied him. For her, this path was also a way of kenosis and lessening, from the moment when Simeon told her that her soul would be pierced by a sword, until the moment when this prophecy was fulfilled at the cross of her son. Her humiliation was expressed, among other things, in that humble place where she occupied in the Gospel's narrative, where the central place, and this is no great wonder, is given to Jesus. When his hour is come, his glory was also revealed. Her hour came after the resurrection of Jesus, when the church recognized her as the new Eve and saw her as its own mother. From that time, the life of Mary began not as a simple Jewish woman whom Jesus simply addressed as woman, but as the one whom the church places at the head of the saints, of the hosts of saints, calling her more honorable than the cherubim and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. From that time, her glory is inextricable from his glory. And that's it for that particular reflection on the wedding at Cana in Galilee. So here we already have practically the complete set of everything that has to do with Christ's life on earth. John sees Jesus's life completely and totally through the lens of Pascha. A lot of times you will hear that the beginning of the Gospel of St. John is a Christmas narrative. That is not the case. It is completely and totally Paschal. And that is why in our church, we say the Gospel of St. John 1:1 following at the feast of Pascha. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is not a Christmas gospel. It is a Pascha gospel. And so John sees Christ through that lens of resurrection and everything that needs to happen in order for it to be led up to that. So even this simple miracle, the wedding feast at Cana, becomes an image that foretells what is to come in his triumphant resurrection from the dead, having to do with his communion and how we become partakers of his flesh and blood through partaking of bread and wine. All of that has a hint of it in this particular story, this miracle story of Cana in Galilee. All right. So that's a lot to take in. Does anyone have any questions or any comments they'd like to say? It's a lot, huh? What? So it's it points towards the Eucharist. It points towards his passion. It points towards his resurrection from the dead. All of those things have reference in this particular story. And again, it's unique to John. The other ones have hinted it in terms of the heavenly banquet that's talked about. But a lot of times in that heavenly banquet, what do we see but exclusions? We see people being cast out of those banquets, not otherwise. So yes, a slightly different message that's being proclaimed there. Not quite the same thing that we have here. Oh, you're welcome, Courgette. So are there any other questions or comments that anyone would like to add? Okay, so we will continue on with the stories of the miracles of Jesus. The next section that Metropolitan Hilarion talks about is healings. Okay, so I'll give you the chapter headings that he has, because so this class won't last terribly long, but the healings may take a while because they're of different contexts. But the healings of Christ is next, and then after that, it's casting out of demons. So even there, we'll talk a little bit about demonology itself. That would be fun. And then chapter 5 he has is the miracles connected with the natural world. Okay, so from that we have Jesus in nature, the catching of fish, the calming of the storm, the feeding of many people, walking on water, and so on. The next we'll have the transfiguration. That'll be good. And then finally, resurrection from the dead, because there are several examples before he himself rises from the dead. He raises 3 others. So it's good to look at those too. Okay. Okay. Again, any questions, anybody? Great. Thank you for your time. God bless you and keep you. And we will gather together again next week. Thanks. I appreciate your time.
Next.
All right.
Trevor's here, yeah.
So